This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
It's now my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce the Honorable David Jacobson, the United States Ambassador to Canada. Ambassador Jacobson was sworn in at the State Department as the U.S. Ambassador on September 25th, 2009. Before that, he served as Special Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel. So you students looking for a job, take note. Before serving at the White House, he was an attorney in Chicago for 30 years, gaining expertise in the areas of complex commercial, class action, securities, insurance, and business litigation. So you Fuqua students, please take note of that. Ambassador Jacobson received his JD from Georgetown University and his BA from Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador David Jacobson.
Thank you very much, Peter, Steve, for introducing me. I was indeed one of the people in the White House who helped the president with his political appointments. And we always used to say that the president was responsible for appointments and we were responsible for disappointments. So we're probably not the ones you wanted to talk to then, and my time in that job has passed. I really am pleased to be here to speak about what is a vitally important aspect in the relationship between our two countries. And as you heard, it is probably the most important relationship that the United States has. It is our largest foreign supplier of energy. It is our largest, by far, trading partner. It is just an extraordinary and beneficial relationship to both countries. But before I do that, I want to just take a moment to say a few words about Steve Kelly. Steve recently retired from an extraordinary career and a distinguished career as a Foreign Service Officer of the United States. And throughout that time, he discharged all of his responsibilities with a wisdom and a charm and a grace that is a credit to the people of the United States. He knows as much about the relationship between the United States and Canada and the energy issues that are a part of that as anyone does. He was the Deputy Chief of Mission in Ottawa, which is the #2 person in the embassy. He was also the Deputy Chief of Mission in Mexico City. He was the Consul General in Quebec City, not once but twice. As recently as a few months ago when he stepped down from a relatively short period of time there. And his greatest distinction, as far as I'm concerned, in Canada, is that the gym in the embassy is named after him. Now, looking at him, but and looking at me, you realize that I probably don't go there as often as I should. But every day when I walk past it, thinking that I ought to be going in there, I think of Steve. When I arrived in Canada about a year and a half ago, I was subjected to a well-meaning test of endurance that I have come to remember as death by PowerPoint. The briefings on every which topic were extensive. And while many of the slides are today a total blur, there are two that I recall in great detail. One of them listed the 12 countries with the largest proven reserves of petroleum in the world. Canada is #2. And I think it's fair to say that if you listed the other 11, they're not the ones that have friended the United States on Facebook. The second slide was really even more surprising, at least to me. And that was that of all of the proven petroleum reserves in the world that are not controlled by a government, that 50% of them are in Alberta, which is an extraordinary fact. That if energy security is considered a critical element of our national security, which it unquestionably is, then there is a very stark reality. We use upwards of 20% in the United States of the world's oil, but we control about 2% of the world's oil reserves, and unfortunately, you cannot drill your way out of arithmetic. So given that reality, that we Americans should place extraordinary importance on the fact that we share the largest energy trading relationship in the world with our valued and our trusted neighbor to the north. Canada, as you heard, is our single largest foreign supplier of energy to the United States. We get about 20% of our oil imports from Canada. We get more than 80% of our natural gas imports from Canada. We get pretty much all of the electricity that we don't produce domestically from Canada. And there's probably no single issue that is more important than energy to the long-term strength and prosperity of the United States and to Canada, and to the relationship between our two countries. The President recognized this the other day in his remarks, and more Americans need to become aware of this fact, and so I am very pleased that Duke is putting on this conference to help educate all of us about the energy relationship between our two countries. Now, I'm going to work backwards from the list in the title of this conference, and I want to start by talking about Canada's petroleum resources, and most of all, its oil sands. Most recent forecasts have projected that there are about 170 billion barrels of exploitable crude oil in the oil sands. Some have suggested, and you may hear more about this by some of the folks here who know more about this than I do, that there may be recoverable reserves of somewhere in the neighborhood of 315 billion barrels in the oil sands. That actually exceeds the estimated oil reserves of Saudi Arabia. To put it simply, this vast petroleum resource is going to be exploited. You don't have to be a petroleum engineer to understand that global demand for oil is growing, it's not shrinking. It's being driven largely by emerging economies in Asia and in Latin America. The IAEA says that the world needs to increase oil production by 3.5 million barrels every year just to keep up with the growing demand. So let's lay out some facts plainly. The oil sands are a vast hydrocarbon resource. That resource can be produced economically at current prices and indeed below current prices. There is a market for their product. So one way or another, this resource is going to make it into the global marketplace for oil. Alberta estimates that production from the oil sands by 2015 will be about 3 million barrels a day. Currently, all of Canadian exports from the oil sands are destined for the United States. And the multi-billion-dollar question is that percentage going to change over time? This is a question where energy security and environmental security come together. From a global perspective, there is no issue more critical to the well-being of the planet that we share than climate change. You cannot any longer talk about energy without also talking about the environment. The issues have become two sides of the very same coin. They are deeply intertwined, they're deeply interrelated. And how we handle both of them is going to go a long way toward determining our legacy to our children and to our grandchildren. We're moving in the United States, slowly but surely, away from fossil fuels. But the fact, however much I might or anyone else might hope otherwise, the fact is that we're going to have to rely on traditional forms of energy, and especially fossil fuels, for a long time to come. Now, this has implications both for energy policy and for environmental policy in the United States. First, we need to find ways to increase our supply of fossil fuel energy in the safest, the most responsible, and the most efficient way possible. Every form of fossil fuel extraction creates an environmental impact. That risk has to be managed effectively, and over time, it has to be reduced to the absolute minimum that we possibly can. Now, I've traveled to Fort McMurray and I've seen the oil sands up close. I've met with Canadian officials, with Alberta government representatives, as well as with representatives of the industry, some of whom you're going to hear from later today. I can tell you that I do understand the importance of the oil sands to Canada and to the United States. But I'm also well aware of the significance, and I am also well aware, of the significant steps that have been taken by the industry to reduce the effect of their operations on land, on water, and on the air. But I don't think I am alone in saying this, that more needs to be done. Industry leaders have to do everything that they can, and I think you're going to hear from some enlightened industry leaders today, more than just what government mandates, in order to reduce the carbon footprint of the oil sands. They need to do more to demonstrate how they're meeting the challenges of providing energy security while meeting their obligations for environmental stewardship. They need to do this because attitudes about our energy sources, and in particular energy from the oil sands, is evolving. The issue reminds me of all things about smoking. Maybe that's because I'm here at Duke. Last night, after we finished dinner, I went into the bar at the hotel. And as is the case in bars pretty much everywhere in the United States and in Canada, it is against the law to smoke. Now, 20 years ago, and there are a lot of people in this room who probably aren't old enough to remember this, but 20 years ago, if somebody had told me that it would be against the law to smoke in a bar, I would have thought they were crazy. But the generation in this room was raised to understand the health dangers of cigarette smoke, and so here we are. And today's generation of young people is being raised to understand the dangers to our planet. You learn about it, you talk about it, you're not afraid to speak up about it. Your values and your priorities are different from prior generations, and you're going to bring the kinds of change that's in line with your belief. And therefore, it makes sense for the rest of us to get ahead of the curve, to set precedents that we can be proud of, and to understand what it truly means for energy and for the environment to be linked together. Let's talk about pipelines. How much of Canada's, and the issue here is how much of Canada's oil sands product is going to be destined for the American market? How much is going to go out toward the broader global market? The United States Department of State, with whom I work every day, I'm part of, will play a key role in making that determination. The department is currently assessing a request for a permit to build a new pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline, to carry oil from Alberta down to Oklahoma and then on to refineries on the Gulf Coast. Because this is in active regulatory review, I am not going to address any of the specifics, other than to say that the State Department is considering fully the economic, the environmental, the safety, and the energy security aspects of the project in determining whether the pipeline is in the national interest. I can say that the intense focus on this process by the American public, by their representatives in Congress, by the Obama administration, and by the stakeholders on all sides of this issue underscores the significance of the Canada-United States relationship and the high stakes that are involved. For a long time, our energy relationship has been a well-functioning but much underappreciated dimension of our continental partnership. Now, the debate and engagement engendered by Keystone XL has brought that energy relationship and the pipelines back to the forefront. It brings me to hydropower. The fuel is free. There are essentially no greenhouse gas emissions. What's not to love? Canadian exports of hydroelectricity are already important in the Northeast United States and in the Pacific Northwest. And Canada has about an additional 160 gigawatts of generating potential that could be tapped. Now, to put that into perspective, that's equivalent to about 16% of the total generating capacity of the United States today. It's a lot of electricity. This is clean energy that could be supplied to American consumers economically, and it could help us to transition, for example, from older greenhouse gas intensive sources of electric generation. The real challenge in taking advantage of Canada's hydroelectricity is the same challenge that's faced by the producers of the oil sands. How to get the product from where it comes from to the consumers. How to build, in this instance, the necessary new electric transmission lines. Across North America, transmission capacity has simply not kept pace with electricity demand. A big part of the problem is due to the difficulty in attaining right-of-ways and state and local permits. To get power from Quebec to Boston, you have to erect transmission lines across New Hampshire or Vermont, and not surprisingly, people sometimes object. Decisions in the United States about where to site electricity transmission facilities have historically been made almost exclusively by state regulatory agencies with an understandably local view of the matter. This is because when the laws were passed that set up the regulation that's involved, the electric grid was inherently local. You built an electric, usually coal-fired power plant someplace, and you ran some lines to the neighborhood for the people to use the electricity that was generated there. Obviously, the situation has changed quite a bit since the, I guess, 1930s when those laws were passed. And in order for Americans to get access to clean and reasonably priced Canadian hydropower, we need to have a serious discussion in our country between the federal government in the United States, the federal government in Canada, among the states and the provinces, and among all of the affected communities. A discussion to lay the groundwork for acquiring the necessary social permits to elect an electric grid that meets the demands of the 21st century. Now, a year and a half ago, as those PowerPoints on energy and other things were flashing across my brain, I thought about a little piece of trivia that was somewhere in the back of my mind about Ronald Reagan and his administration. When Reagan was president, there was a golden rule that was always followed by his speechwriters. At all times, the president wanted to be perceived as positive and as optimistic. He went to extraordinary lengths to promote this idea to himself. It extended to the way that he would phrase sentiments. He would refuse to say words like, "we must never forget," because it sounded negative. Instead, he would say, "we must always remember." Sounds more positive. And in energy and the environment, these can seem like overwhelming issues, and the challenges that we have to meet in order to meet our needs in a reliable and in a responsible way. It's a challenge to reduce our emissions and to protect the planet. But in the same way that Reagan approached all problems, that I think we can approach these problems from a very positive perspective. The opportunities that they present to all of us, the opportunities for global leadership in developing new energy and environmental solutions that help us to power the world without polluting it, the opportunities to strengthen our economies through innovation, ingenuity, and the creation of jobs in new industries, the opportunities to more fully protect and to preserve the environment for future generations. If we're going to need, it's true that we're going to need traditional forms of energy for decades to come, but that doesn't mean that we have to be stuck with the old ways of thinking. We can pursue the energy solutions of the future even as we work to make the older forms of energy safer, their use more efficient, their extraction more responsible. And therefore, I thank you for having this conference here today, for inviting me to speak here, and I congratulate you for celebrating what is one of the most important, if not the most important relationships that our two countries have. Thank you very much.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.